Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I read a really interesting article in the last little while about the last call for neoliberalism. It was published in the Globe and Mail, and it's about the new economic order and a party that my guest went to in New York, where he saw the death of neoliberalism, and he's going to talk about that a little bit. My guest is Omer Aziz. He is the author of a book called Brown Boy. He's a lawyer. He's the Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard University. He's a former foreign policy advisor to the Justin Trudeau government. And he's a really interesting columnist and author. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So tell me, what is your argument about the death of neoliberalism?
Yeah, well, as I laid out in the article, we're living through this pivotal economic moment right now. I think COVID and the pandemic accelerated some of what I'm describing, but essentially over the last 30 to 40 years, we had what I call neoliberalism, financial deregulation, export of markets, basically preferring capital over labor, and a whole series of policy decisions were made in Canada and the United States, right? Free markets ran wild. A lot of people were lifted out of poverty. Supply chains went overseas. What I'm arguing is that over the last 4 to 8 years, we're seeing the consequences of neoliberalism here in our own country. What does that look like? And in the United States, what does that look like? Factory closings, people being laid off, jobs going overseas, and the human consequences of that. Now, COVID really exposed what happens when supply chains in critical industries go overseas, including to potentially hostile nations, right? And Trump exposed that as well. And I think everyone is starting to understand in the United States, in the Biden administration, as well as in Ottawa and the Trudeau administration, that we're living through a new economic moment, and the old era of free markets going wild is over, and that voters in our democratic countries have responded that they do not want unfettered capitalism abroad, and that our society is more than just an economy. And so what I tried to describe in the article was the beginning point of outlining what a new economic order would look like.
So, even some people taking a look at Joe Biden have said that he's not a supporter of the Washington consensus, and he may actually be more of a supporter of what was thought of as the Beijing consensus, where maybe not authoritarian governments, but industrial strategy was the key, and a very mercantilistic economic system. Is this what you're talking about?
Sort of. I mean, we've seen the beginnings of it with the Biden administration, the Inflation Reduction Act, huge investments in domestic climate capabilities for the first time in American history, the semiconductor bill, $39 billion to reinvigorate America's semiconductor industry. We're seeing it in Canada as well. But just think about this, okay? When a lot of technology has gone overseas, especially to places like China, and they can, through their political machinations in government, manipulate technology and rules of commerce, that harms us and our interests over here, right? And what I was trying to lay out in the article was that this argument was made by political leaders over the last 30 years that free trade would benefit everyone and would benefit us as well. And it did in the aggregate. But when you distribute it out and you look at working class people, middle class people, poor people, it really negatively impacted them. And we never took into account, literally into the accounting and into the economic forecasts, the costs, the human costs of tearing communities apart, of laying off people, of outsourcing jobs and not having any policy mechanism in our government to help those people. Are we really surprised that populist nationalist leaders have emerged when we basically told the whole working class, the backbone, industrial backbone of our country, we have no support for you, but we will allow for capital to move overseas and for other financial decisions to be taken not in your interests? Are we really that surprised? So I don't think it's necessarily a swing to full-blown mercantilism and protectionism. At least I don't want to see that. What I like to see is greater, clearer rules of the road, and that maybe we do need a narrow bit of protectionism when it comes to critical industries. I mean, we don't want free markets involved in industries that are related to national security, that are related to artificial intelligence, that are related to nanotechnology, biotechnology, cyber technology. I mean, one would think that in 2023, it's just common sense that certain industries should be more integrated and grounded over here. So what we're seeing now is a correction to the excesses of neoliberalism over the last 30 years. And what I'm hoping for is that it's not an overcorrection.
let's get into some of the details after a message. But before we go farther, you actually had a really intriguing way of sort of describing this death of neoliberalism by describing a party that you attended in Manhattan that the Prime Minister walked into. Tell me about that party, if you could.
Yeah, so I was actually in LA for the LA Times Book Festival. My first book had just come out, is just behind me. There's more details in that too, but I just got this email, and right when I landed at LAX, saying that I'd been invited to this party at Tom Clark's residence, the Consul General, and I had recently hosted a panel there, so I already knew the people. But yeah, the guest of honor was Prime Minister Trudeau, and when I got there were all sorts of like dignitaries and official people there, and yeah, there was this sense of disquiet in the air of great change is coming. The times are changing, right? And we don't know what they're going to look like. And then as I lay out in the article, the Prime Minister, someone I work for, we had an interaction towards the end of the party. And I can let your viewers know right now what happened, but we can also save it.
No, let me know what happened.
Okay, well, I basically asked him, and I think like when I left government, I had made some critiques about discrimination there and systemic racism. So I don't know. And then the Prime Minister's in my book as well. So I wasn't sure what the response was going to be when I was going into it. And then we had this moment where we interacted, and I asked him what intellectuals, thinkers, writers, lawyers, what people outside the system could do to uphold democratic principles. And he sort of stepped back for a moment and thought of it, and then he just gave me this answer, which is like, you shouldn't be so cynical about people working on the inside. And before I could respond, he had moved to the next group of people. And I thought that, I'd much rather respond in person and give an answer then, but I'm also a writer and an author. So if you don't allow me to respond in person, I'm going to do what I do, which is respond in writing and put my name behind it. And how I responded was, it's not cynical to ask leaders to live up to their own standards. It's not cynical to worry about the death of neoliberalism and these ideas. It's not cynical to be worried about the rage and discontent and hopelessness spreading among young people. If he thought these things were cynical, then I'm deeply concerned about what's coming next. And I fear that we are intellectually and politically unprepared for what's coming next. And that's much worse than any kind of critique someone could make.
What's coming next? Do you think it's some sort of authoritarian or a mercantilist kind of approach, or what? Protectionism back to where it was in the 1930s after the Great Depression?
I mean, hopefully not, but also it shouldn't be the capitalism of the 90s and 2000s that gave us the financial crisis, greatest bank failures, loss of trillions of dollars of wealth. We weathered that storm in Canada only because of what? Because of government regulations, right? Our banks ended up being the anomaly around the world. But I think we are seeing the consequences of neoliberalism and free markets and this excess of neoliberalism in terms of our democracy. We're seeing a weakening of participation. We're seeing a weakening of trust. We're seeing people growing more distrustful, fearful, and critical of government. We're seeing them uphold and fall into conspiracy theories about the World Economic Forum and global elites, that because they feel that they have been misled and misled by leaders for 30 to 40 years. And I just, like, you look at the numbers, hundreds of thousands of jobs have gone overseas. Another thing that's related to
this. But we've got the lowest unemployment, both in Canada and the United States, than we've had for generations.
I mean, unemployment rate can be low for a number of reasons, including people stopping looking for work, right? Like, they've just given up hope. So I agree. There's a complexity with the economy right now in terms of inflation is going down, unemployment's going down, but there still is this sense of people living in very precarious times. I mean, who cares if the unemployment rate goes down if you can't afford the $4,000 a month it costs to live in 300 square feet in Toronto?
But
who cares if it costs?
The inflation rate is up because unemployment is so low and demand has skyrocketed because people had pent up the demand coming out of COVID, extra savings, and they started spending. And spending like crazy. So, all the economic situation suggests that people are doing incredibly well, not poorly, so much so that they're driving up demand. I hear that used cars are at the highest prices ever. Home prices are at the highest prices ever. So that suggests that, yes, it's expensive, but people are driving that demand. So if that's the truth, how could we have exported so many jobs?
Well, I think jobs and, wages, there's been a disconnect between them. I mean, wage growth has been stagnant. Middle class wage growth has been stagnant. Home ownership has been stagnant. I mean, across every statistic for the middle class, working class people, stagnation. And it's a lot worse in the United States. And I think that those are things to take into account. I mean, if people aren't earning more money and there's no opportunity to move forward, then does it really matter if upper classes are able to buy cars and buy second homes? No, we're living actually, if you look at the inequality rate between the haves and the have-nots, it's one of the worst in probably a century. And again, compounded by the United States. I mean, you can just take Canada and the United States as an example here. Why are we less worse than them? I would posit it's because of regulation. We had a regulatory framework that avoided having the excesses of capitalism, right? And also we have a more egalitarian spirit that's been promised to people. You work hard here, you play by the rules, and the Canadian dream could be achieved for many people and for many generations, including immigrants. That Canadian dream has also frayed. I mean, every young person I know who's a young professional struggling to find housing and looking at the numbers and comparing them to the rest of the world. I mean, in many ways, Canada is failing its young people. The inflation rate or the unemployment rate is poor solace to someone who has worked hard for 20 or 30 years and they can't afford a home and their wages have been stagnant and it's difficult for them to move ahead and they're wondering why. But our GDP is growing and the rate of economic expansion is growing. So how have the gains of the last 30 years been shared widely? How has the prosperity been shared? It hasn't. And that's the reason why we're seeing a lot of rage towards the system. And I would propose that rather than looking down upon people who might be rageful towards elites, that we should try and understand where that rage is coming from.
Fascinating conversation tonight. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes and talk a little bit more with Omer Aziz about his book, about his article, about the death of neoliberalism, about his interaction with Justin Trudeau at this party, and what this means for our politics. Stay with us, everyone. Interesting conversation tonight. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a real pleasure of mine to be chatting tonight with Omer Aziz. He is a very smart guy. He's written a book, Brown Boy, it's called, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And he's written a really provocative article published in the Globe and Mail in regards to the death of neoliberalism. Let me tell you a little bit about Omer, if I could, to start with. He got the gold medal in political studies at Queen's University. What do you got to do to get a gold medal? Is that like completely number one? Congratulations. Awesome.
Yeah. And the politics department there is difficult.
And then you got first class distinction for a Master of Philosophy and International Relations at the University of Cambridge. And then he got a JD, a Juris Doctor, a law degree at Yale Law School. Yale Law School is where the Clintons met. And the Bush, was it one or two Bushes that went there? So, lots of smart people have graduated from Yale. And now you are the Radcliffe Scholar at Harvard University. Tell me, what's the Radcliffe Scholar?
So the Radcliffe Fellowship I'm actually coming towards the end of my time at Radcliffe, but it's like the Radcliffe Fellowship is the premier fellowship at Harvard University for scholars and writers. And I've been working on my second project, which is weird to say because we haven't discussed my first project, but I was in Cambridge for a year and just it's great. I mean, Harvard was a dream come true, and I've been getting a lot of good work done since then too.
So I thought Radcliffe was the female college at Harvard. So I was surprised when you said that you got the Radcliffe Fellowship.
Yeah, it used to be. Radcliffe College was the premier women's college, not just in the United States, but the world, because women couldn't attend Harvard, right? They weren't allowed to. And once Harvard and Radcliffe merged, then, women could attend Harvard. So Radcliffe became a separate institute as like a sanctuary for thinkers, for scholars. They really focus on the advancement of women's rights, the advancement of minority rights in America and worldwide. And of course, both those topics now are in the news, and they're really important, those issues. So yeah, Radcliffe is a very special place. It's serene to me. It's sanctuary to me. And I got some really good thinking and writing done there. And I'm always going to, be connected with them. So
I had the privilege of attending Harvard as well. And one of the things that I enjoyed the most is that anyone, when I was there, anyone of note anywhere in the world that wanted to go on a speaking tour and make a speech came to Harvard and spoke, whether it was a political person or a business person or whatnot. And it was a real incredible opportunity. And so I found an unbelievable pleasure in interacting with people from around the world and speakers from around the world. Do you find that as well?
Yeah, there's a great international community there as well, of people just from around the world, and they do so many interesting different things intellectually. So being in that environment of like sharp intellectual diversity, it felt like Disneyland meets Midtown Manhattan in terms of intellectual activity. So just by walking there, you can get inspired and provoked and intellectually stimulated. So I love that environment. And then being able to meet people from different walks of life, different backgrounds, getting to interact with policymakers was super important to me as well in the work that I'm doing, congressmen, senators, etc. So yeah, I mean, it's a very special institution to me, and known around the world. I think it's like probably the intellectual capital of North America. I mean, it's a contested space for sure. I don't want to be too controversial, but it is definitely one of them.
And you worked as a policy advisor for the Office of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, for a while. Is that correct?
Yes.
What was that like?
It was good. I think it was the first year of the Trump administration, and so there was a lot going on between NAFTA and Donald Trump, but also North Korea. I think we saw the first inklings of what China was going to become then as well. There was the issue of the Rohingya genocide, which I was advocating very strongly for, to use Canada to use strong language on that and condemn it early. So I think being in the center, being involved in global politics in that way, and seeing how foreign ministers interact and heads of state interact, and how diplomacy is done, what are the pressure points within government, what's the relationship between political staffers and the civil servants, how do you actually get things done, how do you build consensus? I saw the machinery really from the inside, all of it. And then, of course, the foreign ministry is arguably the most prestigious ministry and one of the most important, because we're conducting Canada's external foreign policy. So getting to see that as well, in our relationship with Prime Minister's office and the integration, in a very unique moment of history. I mean, that period of like 2017, 2018 was just fundamental, right? And what was happening in the world. And in many ways, we're still living through the consequences of some of those times as well.
And then you wrote this book, Brown Boy. Tell me a little bit about Brown Boy. Is that your first project as a Radcliffe Scholar, or was it something else?
Yeah, so I just want to show people this was it. This is it. This came out in April, Brown Boy, a memoir, and it is a book about growing up working class in Scarborough, and child of immigrants, son of immigrants, and the world of Scarborough, and of not really having any aspirations or hopes through life, and going the way of many young men who are aimless, disconnected from my parents, not reading, and then all of a sudden I have this change in perception. There's a great epiphany that happens in the book as well, and then it charts the self-education and going to Queens and the places that you listed, to Paris, to Yale Law School, to working in government, and in each juncture kind of reflecting on who we are, what is the story here, how did I get here, and what are the legacies of history, because the legacies of history in terms of colonialism, in terms of violence, world wars, like those things don't go away. And so it's a memoir, but it's also a work of ideas and a meditation on ideas about identity and the past and the future. So I'm deeply proud of it. It's like 4 months old, right? So I don't know. I'm enjoying the ride and enjoying the process too. But no, I wrote this before Radcliffe, but it came out while I was at Radcliffe.
And so what was your first project at Radcliffe then? You said you're on to your second project now.
Yeah. My project at Radcliffe was my second book, my sophomore project, which I'm working on now, which is an extended study and piece on the rise of fascism in the West, in the United States and in the West, and kind of deconstructing how that's happened and why that's going on, and bringing together like law, reporting, history, and like offering a way forward as well. Like, how do we deal with the rise of right-wing authoritarianism?
No, that sounds like
Now,
another good column, if not another great series of interviews, in addition to a good book.
yeah, but doing the book is like my main thing. Like I'm focused on. I'm actually working on it right now. I've been working on it today, even in the writing process of it. I'm really discovering what the structure is going to be. I know what the arguments are, and I know what the narrative is, but discovering the structure within the writing as well is really important to me. I want my books to be well crafted, and I want a layperson to connect with them. So a lot of the fun happens in this stage of the process.
I look forward to chatting with you about that in the future. But let's come back to this neoliberalism,
Sure.
the death of neoliberalism column that you penned. You spoke about Joe Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, delivering a major speech calling for a new economic order, where he said that market efficiency and supply chains and jobs had all moved overseas, and it was time for a new industrial and innovation strategy that is grounded in domestic sources of production. I heard a fascinating and, frankly, I thought disturbing interview with one of the Republican presidential candidates, who said that that his policy would be that we wouldn't attack Taiwan. We would defend Taiwan until 2028 and until chip production had been moved from Taiwan to the United States. But after that, he would no longer declare that the United States would defend Taiwan. And the comeback to him was, that's an incredibly self-serving, nationalistic, mercantilist kind of foreign policy, that you're no longer standing on principles, you're only standing for economic gain. And he said, yeah, I want to be strategically honest. What do you think of that?
Well, I think we're having...
Go ahead.
I think we're having a major foundational debate about foreign policy and what the United States stands for, and that this is going into the fundamentals of America and the way the world is going. Look, for 20 years, there was endless war on one side, and on the other side, there was critiques of that war. But then when the Democrats were in office through Obama, they more or less extended many of the Bush era policies. Trump comes like a wrecking ball to this consensus, the foreign policy consensus. You'll recall that Trump stood on the debate stage. And again, I'm no fan of Donald Trump. I disagree with him on everything. But I recall this moment where Donald Trump stood on the debate stage and really pointed out Jeb Bush and how the Bush family had taken the United States to war in Iraq and what the consequences of that were. And he got booed for it by a lot of people. But again, it was like this wrecking ball to the assumptions. For 20 years, you couldn't really question, the moral intentions of the United States going into the wars. There was this hysterical kind of patriotism going on, and that camouflaged a lot of the core issues. So now we're in this moment where we're having this debate of what America stands for, right? Should it be human rights and rule of law? Should it be realpolitik, strategic long-term interests, spheres of influence? Should it be trying to be meddling in other countries' affairs? Should it be purely economic? And what's the relationship between economic self-interest and values as well? What's the relationship between building an international system that benefits everyone, but also serves our self-interests too? So I think those are the questions that are being debated in Washington, across America, and Canada too. They're foundational questions in terms of what do our countries represent in the world? What interests should they serve in the world? And how do our foreign policies abroad connect to what we're doing at home for our citizens? And again, there's this is a very liminal time right now with this debate. Like some people, like that Republican senator, are going to lay out, an explicitly economic point of view. 55% of Americans think that the United States should not give more aid to Ukraine. There's going to be a fundamental debate over that as well, over what the role of the United States is abroad. And we're going into election season, so I can anticipate that many of these debates will intensify. And there's not clear answers. You're seeing, I think President Biden should be making a major foreign policy speech, bringing all these things together. I mean, I should say I know Jake. Jake was actually my professor at Yale Law School, and he supervised my paper when I was there. So I know some of the assumptions of the Biden administration policy officials. I respect them a lot. However, the president, I think, has been not as vocal as he should be, and he needs to lay out what his vision is for America's role in the world that encapsulates all these different things: rule of law, democracy, but also foreign policy serving citizens at home and economic self-interest being built into that. China operates with economic self-interest, right? Like Russia operates with economic self-interest too. American companies are the only companies that, when they grow large enough, international enough, they say we're no longer American companies, we're multinational companies. That's actually what they say to the trade representative and to Congress. So I think what we're seeing is more domestic shoring up and bringing back some of the capital that has gone overseas, and this kind of cult of globalization. Again, we don't want to see it swing so far in the other way that America becomes protectionist, but we also don't want a race to the bottom in terms of globalization and not taking care of our own people at the end of the day, right? Like, what is this? A lot of voters are going to ask, what's the purpose of a democracy? What's the purpose of having a country, right? We're not just here to like have trade deals and corporate managers get really wealthy and wealthy property owners get wealthier and people who make most of their money off of capital get wealthier. But we need to look at the rest of our society, working class and middle class people too, have had a really hard time. And how do we bridge that? How do we bridge the gap between where we are and where we need to be? And I think that's where a lot of this discussion is going to be happening. And I think it's going to be a critical time to be having this conversation. I think we only have 4 or 5 years to have this conversation. And then the rules of the road will be written for the next 50 years, or will be an international chaos.
Or will be an international chaos. Really?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a final step to erode the principle of territorial integrity, and that we had the principle that we had enshrined in the UN Charter after World War II, that states cannot change the map by force, right? That's what we had learned after World War II. That's why we had a UN Charter. And Putin went up against that line in Crimea in 2014, and then he went up against that line in Syria in 2016, 2015, and he went up against that line with supporting Donald Trump's election in 2016, and then he went up against that line and crossed it in 2022 with the invasion of Ukraine and the attempted annexation of a member state of the United Nations. I think China's watching. I think other Russian leaders are watching. I think other authoritarian leaders are watching, and we're fighting over a basic norm and principle right now. So yes, chaos.
But you're suggesting that we should become more, or we're going to become more isolationist, more protectionist, which is as if we didn't learn the lesson of World War II, and we didn't learn the lesson of the last 8 years of what has happened. One might come to a different point of view and say, really what this was a repeat of 1936 and the attack into Czechoslovakia and Austria, and then in 1939 into Poland. And it took, just like we didn't move against Crimea, we didn't move against Austria and Czechoslovakia, and we didn't move until they actually attacked Poland. And so really it's the opposite lesson that we should be learning, is that isolationism and protectionism and not worrying about the rest of the world, just caring about ourselves, is the wrong answer.
Yeah, well, arguably the U.S. was pretty involved with Ukraine. They just didn't want to go all the way, right? Like you can deter early on, I think, without doing a maximalist position at the end. I agree with you. I think there should have been more deterrence. Putin should have been deterred. If he had been actively deterred at some point in the last 10 years, we would not see an invasion of Ukraine, right? But there was no one and nothing to deter him. President Obama could have done a lot more to deter him as well. I mean, everyone laughed at Mitt Romney in 2012 when he said Russia was a number one geopolitical enemy. But if you look at Russia, if you look at China, if you look at China's attempt to build a new economic order, which they are also doing, I mean, let's not get it confused here. China is the number one long-term strategic adversary for the West and for the United States. It's not even close, in fact. But yeah, I stand by my point that there could be chaos if we don't begin to implement new rules of the road that benefit everyone, but ultimately also uphold democracy and rule of law. If we just go to spheres of influence of, okay, Europe is for Russia, Asia is for China, the Western Hemisphere is for the United States, I fear that same replay of the 20th century. Looking out for your citizens' interests in foreign policy, in terms of economics does not equate to let's be completely disengaged from the world and just be inward facing. Far from it. What it does is it advocates for one's citizens, including middle class citizens who haven't been at the table and are not at the table of foreign policy decisions, but while also being deeply engaged with the rest of the world. I mean, I don't think we should have a completely aggressive posture to China. I think it's good the minister's going there. It's good to engage with them on climate. We have to engage with them on climate while we check them economically, we check them militarily, we continue our alliance with the United States and the West and engage in those conversations in terms of how to check China's rise militarily. But like on climate, we want to work with them. Right? Like where we can work with them on climate, we should be working with them. So I think it's about losing the assumptions of the last 20 to 50 years, many of them a hangover from the Cold War, and being able to play a more complicated game of chess. We're going to build an economic infrastructure that benefits our citizens and also benefits everyone else. That's fair to the middle class. We're going to engage with China on areas that we can engage with them on, and we're going to compete on areas that we can compete with them on. We are going to promote free markets, but regulated markets and regulations for workers and for land and for environment. We're going to do all of that. And on some important strategic industries, yeah, we should be, having, I think as Jake had described it, a narrow yard with a tall fence for certain industries. It's going to be very important. And if you go through, this is the final point I'll make, but even if you go through the original writings of Adam Smith and some of the original free market theorists, they did not want completely unfettered free markets, the rule of the casino, the rule of Wild West. That was not their intention. In their writings, they talk about support for domestic industries, for infant industries, allowing for industries to grow, right? And I think it's super important that we can, have multiple thoughts at once and not just be able to think, okay, it has to be full on engagement or full on boots on the ground or full on, neoliberalism, or it has to be mercantilism and isolationism. I mean, in fact, we've tried both already. We see the consequences of isolationism. We also see the consequences of unfettered markets and neoliberalism and the complete wipeout of wealth as well. And I think we need to find a happy medium and have this debate that we're going to be having in terms of how do we actually, have a foreign policy and a world system that benefits our citizens in the middle class while also increasing prosperity and peace around the world, and looking at the world realistically and recognizing when a country like China or a country like Russia has pushed a norm and crossed a line.
We got to take a break. We're going to return in just 2 minutes with Omer Aziz. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Interesting conversation tonight with Omer Aziz, who is the author of a book, Brown Boy. He's a Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard University. He's a Yale Law School grad. He's a gold medalist in political science at Queen's University. He worked in Parliament Hill with Chrystia Friedland as a foreign policy advisor. And he's written a column recently in the Globe and Mail that I found really quite interesting called The Death of Neoliberalism. Omer, let me ask you a few questions if I could. You said this mass destruction of wealth. You said the cult of globalization. But yet in your article, you point out that 500 million people were brought out of poverty because of this, Washington consensus, this globalization, this free trade. And we have had, one of the biggest increases in wealth globally that we've ever enjoyed in history. Today we have the lowest unemployment level that we've had since the 1950s. We've got, incredible prosperity, maybe not completely equally shared, but incredible prosperity. So how do you rationalize that we've had this great wealth destruction and that so many people are left behind from our economic progress?
Yeah, I mean, I made that point in the piece, right? Like capitalism lifted millions of people, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It essentially was China's anti-poverty program. I mean, the China of today is unrecognizable from the 80s. the liberalization of markets in India were also very important. But I drew a key distinction between capitalism and markets and also neoliberalism, which is removing all the rules and fostering deregulation, including of finance and other industries. And hence we had the great financial crisis, the great recession, and the wipeout of trillions of dollars of wealth, right? I mean, that's just a fact. And even recently, like these bank failures that we're seeing, right? Like I think these are this is a failure of regulation, and that we need to have stronger, tighter regulation on banks. But look, I'm not anti-capitalist. I'm pro-capitalism, but I'm pro-smart capitalism. I'm pro-regulated capitalism, and I'm pro-capitalism that benefits all people, not just wealthy investors at the top and corporate managers and billionaires. The aggregate percentage, the disproportionately the percentage of gains that have gone to the wealthiest 1% are dwarf for the middle class. I mean, in my piece, I quoted there's 2,500 billionaires who own more wealth than 50% of the population. How is that morally justified? You know, people shouldn't get upset at the messenger for raising these signals. What I'm telling you is that if you don't have people like me who have worked on both sides, or I grew up working class and I worked for and saw these elites and kind of the assumptions that undergird policy, what I'll say is, you know, the next iteration of this, if we don't get it fixed, people are going to reach for their metaphorical pitchforks, because the economy does not benefit the ordinary person. The ordinary person cannot make a living. It's very difficult to make a living. It's very difficult to see increased wage growth. It's very difficult to own a house. And home ownership historically was the way in Canada and the United States that the middle class built their wealth. And if young people are priced out of home ownership, we're not going to have the opportunity to build wealth over the long term. So let's not look at just what the rate is right now. And let's just not look at what it was a month ago. Let's extrapolate and project forward. What happens when you have a generation that is priced out of home ownership and is effectively become a permanent renter class? What are going to be the political consequences?
Okay, and I think that that's a big issue. There's no question. But let's talk about it for a second. So the Ontario provincial government, the BCE provincial government, one which is Conservative, the other one which is a New Democratic Party, CMHC, which is for social housing, effectively, Stats Canada, have all come out with reports in the last little while that effectively say overregulation is the cause of the lack of supply that has led to the increased housing prices, and therefore the challenge with home ownership.
Who does that benefit? Who does that benefit, though?
Well, effectively, it benefits the people that have already got homes.
Okay, if you're a multimillionaire, if you're a multimillionaire landlord, is there too much regulation for you to buy a home or to build a home?
Yeah, that's
I know a lot of really wealthy people who have built homes out of, it's just some paperwork you have to get signed. So I don't think it's the housing. I agree. Let's remove the regulations and let's build hundreds of thousands of homes. I agree. But let's also discuss why it is we're building 200,000 homes a year when we need 5-10 million homes.
Well, the problem
How is it there's a massive shortage? And why is this not seen as a structural problem?
I think it is a regulatory problem. It's not a structural problem. The reality is that we are building something like half the number of homes per capita in Canada than we were in the 1960s. And so therefore, when our population has grown and we're building less on a per capita basis, that's a problem. And it takes something like 2 to 3 times as long to get a development approved, a house approved, as it does to actually construct it. And so regulation, over-regulation, has ended up being the villain here and the problem that has escalated the price of home ownership. Now, on the other side of things, I think that you're quite correct. If you take a look at the statistics, median household income has not grown in real terms in the last something like 10 or 15 years in Canada. And our former Minister of Finance has issued written a book saying that we have not got a policy of prosperity, an attitude of growth, an attitude of prosperity. And so therefore we need to have more of a growth agenda. The Harvard Growth Lab has put forward a book about that prosperity has not been an objective of governments in Canada and the United States. It's just been, as you said, deregulation. So I guess the issue for me is I'm surprised that you are convinced that industrial strategy and more regulatory incursion into the economics are going to be a solution when we've tried that so many times before.
I
and
mean,
has worked.
you have to be smart though, right? Like you deregulate certain industries like housing, allow people to build. Those regulations that you put in that you described were not written by poor working class and middle class people. Okay, they were written to benefit wealthy elites once again. So yeah, you deregulate if it helps all people. If we can actually build housing, we have such a huge population that's unhoused right now. But we have to regulate on certain things like chips manufacturing, like biotech, like national security related adjacent technologies and industries. That just makes sense. We shouldn't be having our most foundational secrets leaking and going to Beijing, right? That's totally domestic investments in climate and clean tech. I think that's smart as well. It shouldn't be the sake, like the old school liberalism was regulation for the sake of regulation. This should be, we should regulate when necessary and allow for prosperity, but as long as it's a shared prosperity. I mean, we've had economic growth for 20 years. We've had GDP per capita growth as well. But again, in the aggregate terms, not distributionally, right? Which tells me that there's something in the rules of capitalism that we got wrong. If a whole swath of the population didn't benefit from the promises that were made. I mean, it's not like they were asking for entitlements, young people. These were promises that were made. You work hard. I was told, if you work hard, you play by the rules, you know, you go forward in life. This is the Canadian dream.
You were the gold medalist. You worked on Parliament Hill. You're now
Well, I'm speaking for a lot of people. I'm speaking for a lot of people who aren't as privileged to speak on the Brian Crombie show, you know?
So in support of your argument, I saw a recent report that said if you actually take London out of the English statistics, that the balance of England, ex-London, the Greater London, is like something like the 30th most well-to-do state in the United States. And so the rest of England has not prospered, but the financial elite in London has prospered dramatically. You know, I think that lots of people have analyzed why Trump won in 2016, and people have gone back and forth on whether this is right or wrong, but have suggested that that the coasts did well, extremely well with the Washington Consensus and this neoliberalism that you've criticized, but the interior of the United States, the Rust Belt, the industrial Rust Belt, did not. Do you think that's the issue?
I mean, that's part of it. Like even within the coast though, right? Like people who are middle class workers have struggled. It's very hard to make it in New York or Boston or any of these places. There's also home ownership issues there as well and other economic factors. So yeah, I mean, elites on the coasts for sure. The heartland didn't do well, and the thing is, like, no one was looking out for their interests, right? Like even if a portion of the population is angry or feels left out, if they feel like they have a political voice and they can channel that, then we don't see the support for a wrecking ball populist like Trump. But I mean, the Republican Party sold them out. Essentially, they just became a party of like rich capitalists and evangelicals. The Democratic Party became more a party of professionals and corporate managers, people with Yale and Harvard degrees, but no one was looking out for white middle class and working class people or working class people of any color, frankly. And so one of the things that we saw was you look at the rise in opioid deaths, right? Like when I was in my first year of law school, it was maybe 40,000. Last year, it was 100,000 US overdose deaths, right? That is also connected to the hollowing out of communities in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania and upstate in New England. You know, the lack of regulation, the lack of political oversight, the lack of a political representation. This is why people went and ended up supporting Trump. You throw in Trump's racist dog whistles and being able to like trigger people, and you know, because he doesn't have an economic plan necessarily, so he has to bring culture into it. Chinese people are taking your jobs, too many immigrants, Mexicans, etc. So he threw in the racism and was able to trigger enough people to get them out to vote. You know, in 2020, still he lost, but he won more votes than second most votes ever for a president. You know, and he swept the Republican primary. He's leading by a huge margin right now as well. It's not even close. So I think Trump, rather than focus on Trump right now, and we didn't even, I mean, there's so many issues with Trump today that with his indictments and the legal troubles, but think of the political voice Donald Trump is representing, all those people who are supporting him. Those are people who feel left out, and they're now enraged, right, against this system. And many of them now are also buying conspiracy
But what you're
theories.
calling for is more socialism, more more active industrial strategy. It's the opposite of what Trump is about, is it not?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Trump's premises can be right. That doesn't mean you agree with his conclusions, right? That doesn't mean like, you agree with building a wall. I mean, all of his solutions have been symbolic, but yeah, a little bit more regulated capitalism in certain areas, more democratic socialism. I don't like these labels though, because in certain areas you might have to deregulate, right? In certain industries, you might have to give more subsidies to think of long-term geoeconomic strategy, right? So I don't like these labels as much, but yeah, I mean, we want more state control of certain things. You can back off from the presumption that existed universally that as soon as the government was involved, it was a bad thing, right? Or that presumptively there should just be deregulation.
But has government been involved and it's been a good thing?
I mean, all of our industries, the Industrial Revolution, I mean, all of our industries were built because the government was involved. The internet was built because the government gave huge subsidies, huge investments. You have a vaccine and I have a vaccine because the government was involved and incubated and invested hundreds of billions of dollars into vaccine production, not just in COVID, but before as well. I mean, our country has no vaccine production. So that's a good example of the things I would want to see. If we had invested in domestic capabilities before COVID, if we had one of our prime ministers who had long-term insight and weren't just thinking about the next election, if we had some people with vision, maybe we'd be producing vaccines as a G7 country with one of the top GDPs in the world, a rich country. We really behave sometimes like a country that doesn't belong on any of these lists. We should have had at least some domestic vaccine capability production in 2020, 2021. And the reason we didn't is because we've never had industrial or innovation strategy whatsoever. So I think like thinking smart and long-term will get us very far. And it means political leaders looking beyond just, the day's headlines and issue management and what's going on social media and actually having a vision. When I was in government, I'll tell you, no one was really thinking long-term. No one had a long-term plan. No one was even having that conversation. If we don't think long-term and project into the future, we're going to be ill-equipped to deal with it. It shouldn't come as a surprise.
Chatting with Omer Aziz tonight about a column about the death of neoliberalism. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Omer Aziz, one of the smartest young men I've had the privilege of chatting with. I gotta get your book, and if not this one, the next one that's talking about white supremacy and fascism in the Western world.
You have to get this one too, Brian.
Okay, I look forward to it, and I got to get you to sign it. I got to tell you, I'm a few years older than you, and my final exam at Harvard Business School in 1989, you probably weren't born then, was a cover story of Foreign Affairs that Japan was going to take over the world. Because the attitude generally then was Japan had a far better industrial strategy system and that had bested the Western world in its abilities to run the economy and have government and kiatsus that work together in a cooperative fashion, different companies together that were going to take over the world. And I'm wondering now, given how poor that judgment was and forecast was, given the lackluster growth in Japan all since we thought it was going to take over the world, about your analysis. Right now, China and their growth has gone down dramatically. Numerous different articles have suggested that all of the growth that had occurred in China in the last couple of years may have been coming to a halt because of government interaction, political interaction, et cetera. And some articles saying they really need to have deregulation and freedom the way that the West has. Otherwise, entrepreneurs are going to be moving to Hong Kong and moving abroad, and that without the freedom for business people to make money and choose where they want to invest, China's not going to have that kind of growth. And that the China growth scenario that we've seen through Deng Xiaoping, et cetera, may be coming to an end under the current administration that is far more authoritarian and far more government, strong-fisted. So my question to you is this a reaction that you and Joe Biden and his foreign affairs secretary, et cetera, is it a reaction to what has happened or what is currently happening? And do you think that maybe this industrial strategy in China, maybe it's come to its final conclusion and it's not going to continue to work.
You know, I think of what the Chinese foreign minister said in the 1950s when he was asked about the French Revolution and what he thought of it, and he said it was too soon to tell, right? And I think it's too soon to tell with China. We are seeing a pivotal change in China. I mean, I was in China in 2016. I was in China in 2018, traveled around the country, met a lot of people, business people as well. And, you know, touching base with them in the last couple of years, it seems like China has become an entirely different country. Even the basic like freedoms that we had then, in terms of getting around, you know, the firewalls and being able to still communicate, like a lot of that has been eroded under Xi's administration. And so maybe Xi's response to the lack of economic growth has been this nationalism, this militarism, expansionism. You know, Hong Kong is being basically annexed part of China now. We're seeing militaristic rumblings with Taiwan. And even China, I saw Xi Jinping said that all of China's future AI technology should be infused with Marxist-Leninist principles, right? So it's interesting. Like, even if China was slowing down economically, though, there's never been a Chinese dream, despite Xi Jinping's marketing of that there's a shared prosperity and citizens have a right to speak and have their voices heard. No, if China, in fact, to illustrate your thesis that China might be slowing down, it's going to respond by politically cracking down and really clamping down on dissent and on any kind of other kinds of ideology. We see what they're doing with the Uyghurs, but also, I mean, from what my friends tell me who were in China and have moved their businesses to Taiwan, Thailand, Hong Kong doesn't count anymore, right? Because Hong Kong has been effectively annexed back part of China, and they're moving elsewhere to Singapore. What they've said is basically like China's making it very difficult for entrepreneurs and business people to operate. And it was always very difficult. Recall that you had to have a joint venture company, right? At least 5149 if you were not from China to even be able to operate in China. And I think what Xi is doing basically is a very extreme version of nationalism that combines militarism. So all of China's supply chains will be at home. They'll be integrated all internally. They'll look to build an economic sphere of influence around them. Historically, that was for 5,000 years China's strategic posture towards the region. It was barbarian management of all the people around. And that's what they're doing right now. And we're going to see, you know, I don't think we're going to see Chinese aggression in the way we think of like Western countries, but we will see them rewriting the rules of the road and advancing their own interests through espionage, through economic competition. And recall that there's no emphasis on democracy or rule of law or citizen participation in China, right? And the Chinese Communist Party, I know for a fact, has studied the Russian and Soviet experience very, very closely. So I would say that, you know, we have to be smart. I think that the elites who got us this Beijing consensus in the first place had a huge economic self-interest to make a lot of money off of China. I think our citizens and our workers lost out on the deal, as they have for most of these trade deals. And I think that it's going to make sense to compete with China economically, invest in our own industries in a limited way, and then work with them on climate. I reject the Japan example just because Japan was like a weak democracy. It was stagnating. It stagnated pretty quickly and it was impacted by financial crises. China is a strong, authoritarian, centralized system with the strongest leader since Mao Zedong. So I think we're in uncharted waters with China now. But in fact, China's going back to where it was for 5,000 years, which is central premier civilization of Asia. And we're going to have to reconcile with that. I mean, America's only 250 years old. Canada's only, you know what, 150 some odd years old. We are infant nations compared to the giant dragon that is China. And I think for us to think long term is going to be difficult as well. I know they're thinking over the next century. I hope that we can start thinking beyond the next election cycle.
Omer Aziz, fascinating conversation. Really appreciate it. And look forward to your book. If people want to read your current book, how can they get it?
It's on Amazon. It's on Indigo, everywhere books are sold. I really support independent booksellers. If you can get it from there, that would be great. And if any of your listeners, if they get it, shoot me a message on LinkedIn and I'll make sure I get it signed for you at some point as well. I really appreciate the support.
Awesome. That's our show for tonight. Thanks everyone for joining us. Good night, everybody.